My name is Daphna Mcferrin. I am the Executive Director of the Benjamin L. Hooks Institute for Social Change at the University of Memphis. So first of all, I'd like to thank each of you for coming out this evening for our open house and also to hear our presentations on our 2018 policy papers. I think most of you know there's food on the side, so feel free to get reception food as we begin. I'd like to thank, again, each of you for coming. I hope when you came in that you picked up our calendar of events for the year. So this is our last event for 2018. But in 2019, we have our National Book Award lecture on January 31st. Our winner is James Foreman for the book Locking Up Our Own Crime and Punishment in Black America. What's not on our calendar and that we've had scheduled since is that we will have a presentation by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis in collaboration with the Hooks Institute, and we will be addressing, the Fed will be addressing the achievement gap for African American males. You'd be surprised to know that African American males, even born at the highest income levels, have the highest rates of falling into poverty. But that's not true of African American females. And the largest study that's been conducted to date in the United States was published in the New York Times, and the Federal Reserve is going to talk about that study on February 19th, its implications for Memphis and the nation. So we'll be sending out notices for that, and that will be here on campus. In March, we're going to have a viewing of films by Emily Yellen on the wives of the 1968 sanitation worker strike. Often when we talk about the sanitation worker strike, we talk about the garbage collectors, but omit the role that women played. And so we will be addressing that at that particular event. So as we get started for tonight, I have a few preliminary things. I'd first of all like to thank the Hooks Institute staff for helping put this together. And I'm going to ask them to raise their hands. Nathan Ball, who's walking the floor, who's our program and media coordinator. Nathan helps produce documentaries at the Hooks Institute. He takes care of our Facebook page, our social media, and many of the presentations tonight, Nathan helped coordinate that with the authors. Associate Director Rory Trammell is in the back. Okay. Elena De La Vega, who you'll hear from, is our Associate Director and also a faculty member in the School of Social Work. Raquez Jones is in the back. Stand-up Raquez. He's the newest member of our staff, and he's the coordinator for the Hooks African American Male Initiative, which is a program on increasing the retention and graduation rates of African American males here at the University of Memphis. So the policy papers tonight are intended to discuss critical issues that impact Memphis, but most specifically Memphis and the nation. You will hear presentations tonight, but also the Commercial Appeal will be publishing a condensed version of each of the policy papers starting in December. At the end of this event tonight, you can pick up the policy papers in a booklet if you want to read them in greater detail. Each of the presenters will get 15 minutes, and I can tell you that's not enough time to go in a lot of detail about the substance of the issues we're going to cover, including automation and robots and its impact on the workforce, end-of-life decisions for people of color, disparities in the juvenile justice system and how they work against minorities, and a fragmented education system. So as you know, we're still counting votes from the November election, and I tell the students and others who are in the room, these are the issues that you are really voting on. The people you elect will be deciding these issues, so it's very important that you understand how they impact your life. So we hope you'll listen tonight, both to understand and learn something new, but also to be an informed citizen of this nation. And hopefully that'll help you decide your elected officials and help you guide the shaping of your communities. So thank you again, and I'd like to introduce to the podium our moderator, Associate Director, Dr. Elena De La Vega.
Good night and welcome everyone. We will begin tonight with a paper by somebody who I have admired for a very, very long time, Dr. Daniel Keel. I remember when I first arrived at the university in 2011 and how impressed I was by all of his work, all of a documentary he had done on the Memphis 13, who are the first 13 African-American students integrated into Memphis public schools, and his work with the law school ever since. Today, I have the enormous pleasure of working with Dr. Keel with Just City, an organization dedicated to promoting criminal justice, help people expunge felony convictions, and really doing something very, very positive, very impactful, and very quick to help Memphis. I think that Just City has helped more people in a consistent way, has been more able to help people also through lobbying efforts in Nashville. And all of this is a lot of the work of Dr. Keel. So I cannot tell you how delighted I am and how pleased I am to have Dr. Keel, who is associate professor at the law school here at the University of Memphis, and whom I admire profoundly. Thank you.
Wow, thank you for such a lovely introduction, and thank you to the Hooks Institute for convening all of us and all of you for being here this evening. Where is my, should I just use that? There we go. So my topic this evening is the dangers of a fragmented educational landscape in Shelby County. So my work at the law school and in life, at least professionally, is looking at school law and school policy. So that's what brings me into this particular topic. And I'm particularly interested in Shelby County. So my goal for the evening, or for the 15 minutes, is to discuss, describe the fragmentation that exists, and sort of a little bit of maybe how we got there, some of the advantages that could exist as a result of that fragmentation, and then maybe focus a little bit more on the disadvantages, the dangers of that fragmentation that exists in the Shelby County education landscape, and then talk about, if there's time, talk about some of the possible ways that we can intervene to get a lot of the advantages while minimizing the disadvantages that exist. So that's my plan and my hope for this evening. I first want to begin by describing what I mean when I say fragmentation. And what I mean when I say fragmentation is that there are a lot of different people in charge of schooling in Shelby County right now. In some counties in Tennessee, there is just a county school district and a county superintendent. And for all public school students, that is ultimately, and the school board that sort of oversees, that is ultimately who's in charge. In Shelby County, we have a more complicated system. We have a more fragmented system. We have more individuals or more entities running schools here than anywhere else in the state. And so I want to first, so that's what I mean when I say fragmentation. Education being run by a lot of different entities in a single place. Okay. So what does this fragmented education landscape look like? We have an unprecedented amount of fragmentation today versus where we were even 5 or 6 years ago. And the three major changes have led to this fragmentation. One is the increase in the number of charter schools. This has happened over the last 7 to 12 years. We have had a significant growth of the charter school sector in Shelby County. Now, charter schools are independently operated, privately operated even, public schools. So they're free, they cannot discriminate in any way, yet they are run privately. We have currently in Shelby County about 25,000 students out of a county population, school-age population of about 170,000 that are in charter schools. Some of those schools are overseen by Shelby County Schools, the big school district here that serves about 116,000, and that is the biggest amount of blue on the screen there. And the remainder of the charter school students are overseen by the second of the developments that has changed the landscape in Shelby County, and that's the Achievement School District. The Achievement School District does not have a locally elected school board, but instead is a function of the State Department of Education. So we have a State Department of Education that oversees schools run by the Achievement School District. Almost all of those schools, and I think I can say all of those schools, are charter schools also. So of the 25,000 students in Shelby County who are attending charter schools, that includes about 11,500 in the Achievement School District. So far, what I've talked about are Shelby County Schools, the big player, which has an elected board and a superintendent. A variety of charter schools, which are independently operated. They are overseen on some level, maybe by the Shelby County Schools, but really have their own autonomous operation. And the Achievement School District, which also has its set of charter schools. Okay, so that's fragmentation, part of it. The third major development over the near past is the fragmenting of suburban school districts in Shelby County. So for those of you who sort of were paying attention over the last 7 years, there was once a sort of unified suburban district called Shelby County Schools, but now there are in fact 6 separate municipal school districts, each of them operating in their own jurisdictions consistent with the suburban municipal boundary lines. Okay, and so those are the 6 other districts that we have. So each of those districts also has a superintendent, also has a school board. Okay, so we have 7 public districts, many dozen charter schools, and the Achievement School District operating as well. So we have a lot of fragmentation. One other group that I want to throw in here is non-public schools. We have a healthy number, about 20,000 students in private, independent, homeschool environments, religious schools, those kinds of things. Those are part of the educational landscape in Shelby County as well. And just to give you a sense of where students are, so you have a sense of that, you can see about 57% of students are in the Shelby County schools, and there is the way that the rest of the students in Shelby County breaks down. Okay. So it's fragmented, okay? That is not maybe the most fragmented school system in the country, but it's among the most fragmented school systems in a metropolitan area in the country. So I want to move for a moment and talk about how that might be a good thing, okay? Because this fragmentation didn't just unfold sort of naturally. There is a purpose built behind it, and I just want to talk a little bit about how that might work. And the 4 key words of how it might work are autonomy, competition, choice, and accountability. And those 4 words sort of contribute to what is generally known as the market theory of education reform. And so the idea here is that if you unleash market forces, it will lift educational quality across the board in a metropolitan area. So you give smaller units, whether they're school districts, smaller school districts like the municipal districts, or even at the school level like a charter school, you give them greater autonomy, greater freedom to do what they want with their schooling. You free them from, it would be described as bureaucratic constraints, and then you unleash innovation. So that's one of the portions of the theory, and that you allow them to compete against each other for students, okay? Because if parents, families, have great choice in where they can send their students, then the schools are going to be competing and making their school more attractive. This is the idea. And so you have autonomy in operation that is given to schools who compete, and parents and families who choose among those schools. And then ultimately, also the last part of it is accountability. If no one's choosing the school, if the school is of poor quality, or if the school is financially being mismanaged, then the school loses its charter, or the school loses its authority to operate. Okay, and so it's different than maybe the traditional schooling model, where a school could exist really regardless of how good or how bad it was. Accountability inserts the possibility that a school might be so bad that it doesn't exist 3 years from now or something along those lines. So that's how fragmentation might succeed. But really the focus of my paper is on the dangers that are inherent in a fragmented system. And so I want to move on to that now. The first is maybe something that is just that we just kind of feel and know, but it's something that is also supportable with data. And it is that whenever you draw a barrier between something, right, and obviously right now I'm talking about between students or schools, there's a tendency to worsen segregation. And that segregation is racial segregation, and in Shelby County it's very much also socioeconomic segregation. And so we have a lot of boundaries that exist here that create the fragmented system. Boundaries between the public school districts, the big Shelby County schools, and the municipal boundaries that protect the municipal school districts. We have the boundary that exists between public schools generally and private schools. We have boundaries between traditionally operated schools and charter operated schools, these sort of privately operated things. Across every one of those lines, there is disparities in the makeup of the students, the demographic makeup of the schools. So just to give an example, charter schools tend to serve a student population that is more socioeconomically disadvantaged than traditional schools. Public schools generally tend to serve a student population that is more socioeconomically disadvantaged than private or independent schools. Okay, so every one of those boundaries tends to worsen segregation. Second, danger, right? So is it such a bad thing that we are segregated? There is an independent bad, right? There's a missed opportunity to gain the benefits of having schools that are reflective of our community. But there's actually also negatives, right? It's not just that we don't get that benefit. There's also negatives that result from segregated schooling. One is that the fragmentation creates this situation in which we only care about our slice of the landscape. We only care about our school or our school district, okay? And that's just sort of an inherent part of fragmenting any system, but in this instance, a school system. We define ourselves, our self-interest narrowly, and then only care about our self-interest and compete with others. Now, maybe that's okay. That's part of what the market theory of education suggests might have good effects. But also, when you combine this narrowed self-interest and this narrow mindset with racial and socioeconomic separation, what you get is a racialized narrow self-interest. A self-interest where when I'm saying my schools, I'm thinking my wealthy white school. It's not exclusively wealthy and white, but it's largely wealthy and white. And so we create, in the first instance, in a situation where we have largely racially identifiable or socioeconomically identifiable schools. That's a mouthful. Try that one. And then second, we define our self-interest along those same lines. Okay, and that ultimately the mindset is of zero sum, because in Shelby County we're not really flush with resources, whether the resources be dollars or whether the resources be teachers or whether the resources be curricular choices, etc. And that leads to sort of the third thing. Administratively separate schooling creates those barriers that allow for opportunities to be kept or hoarded behind the barriers. Okay? And so we have situations in which racially identifiable schools, in which we think in a narrowed socioeconomically or racialized mindset, and that the effect practically is that the opportunities are kept behind the barrier lines. So I'm going to move forward quickly here and talk just a minute about some of the things that are mentioned as implications for policy change in the policy paper. First, I say we need someone minding the whole store, right? We need someone that is thinking about not just their own narrow slice of the pie. So some actor, I think it should be at the county level, that considers a broad view of education in Shelby County. Second, I think that there's a real opportunity in 2018 that might not have existed 30 years ago to utilize technology to blur the boundaries that exist between charter and non-charter, to allow innovations that might be existing in one school to be shared with another school, or maybe even courses that exist in one school, but it's a school that a student can't get to because they live too far away. Allow that student to access that course through technology. And then the last thing I would mention is that the segregation by race, segregation by socioeconomic status occurs not entirely because of the choices people make. Those choices are constrained by the way we set the system up. And just like there are policies, and so what I say is reduce the impact of the laws and the policies that create that situation, so too we could create policies like perhaps allowing transfers across district lines, maybe even vouchers for students to attend private schools. Those kinds of things that would increase diversity, those could be adopted and pursued as well. And I just would like to add, I don't know if you can see it at the bottom because it's under this table, but it's perhaps the most important thing, and it's to note that these suggestions really sit on top of what is the unending work that has to be done in Shelby County, and that's consistent advocacy for greater resources and consistent work to find more effective practices in schools, right? This is the things on top are not a stand-in for that kind of advocacy. That has to continue. So I'll stop here. I'll look forward to questions and answers in the Q&A period. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. That was fascinating. And the next person who's going to present her paper is Dr. Demetria Frank. Dr. Frank, again, is somebody I have been very, very proud to work with. I met Dr. Frank when we both did a TED Talk in January, and I was absolutely impressed. Turned out that this amazing scholar was a colleague professor at the University of Memphis School of Law since 2013. She has a very illustrious career, having practiced law in Dallas and having come from the University of Texas. So, and just hearing her talk about minority contact and all of the things that she talked about, highlighting the disparities that we see every day here in Memphis. Absolutely committed community scholar who is engaged, who is talking to people in the community, who serves the community through scholarship and also through being engaged and just direct service. And I am very, very proud to know Dr. Demetria Frank, and I want to hear more about what she has to say.
So I'm going to talk about implicit bias in Shelby County courts. I'm sure all of you by now have heard that the United States is in a state of crisis when it comes to the rate that we incarcerate individuals. I'm sure most of you have heard the popular statistic that the United States is only home to 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's population of prisoners. That does not stop in adult facilities. And we also have a very big problem with incarcerating youth and the juvenile justice system in general. So my paper, my policy paper addresses our juvenile court in particular in Shelby County, which has been under investigation by the Department of Justice since 2012 and even in years prior. And my paper addresses something that the juvenile court here doesn't like to address itself very much, which is the implications that
the court at different times of the juvenile court process that it discriminates against youth of color. So in Tennessee, black youth make up only about 35% of the total youth population, but about 59% of all delinquent petitions, and about 66% of adjudications, and about 74% of cases that are transferred from youth court to adult court. So that disparity is pretty much consistent through the counties in Tennessee. Shelby County is a big contributor to that disparity. Governor Haslam a couple years ago appointed a blue ribbon task force that found that Shelby County had huge disparities, and the Department of Justice itself over the last few years has noted that disparity. So when the Department of Justice began investigating Shelby County back in 2012, it made 3 major findings. And one of those findings dealt with protection of harm in the facilities at the juvenile court. And that related to things like whether detained youth were going to school, whether they were being held in their cells too long, overuse of solitary confinement, things of that nature. And since 2012, the court has tried to remedy that as well as the other 2 findings. Since June, in our most recent report from the court, June 2018, they were in about 73% full compliance with what they were required to do under the Memorandum of Agreement for facilities. The second area was due process, and that's whether the court is following all of the laws it's supposed to guarantee that the juvenile is adequately represented, that they are given all of the benefits the law affords them, and so on. Things like whether the youth were getting the investigative documents necessary in order to avoid going to adult court, things of that nature. And as of June of 2018, they were in about 86% of compliance, so they were doing pretty well there too. But in the third area of findings, which is the equal protection piece, and equal protection means that citizens serviced by the Shelby County Juvenile Court, that they're getting equal protection under the law, that they're being treated fairly, that there's no disparity with regards to race, creed, color, that sort of thing. And as of June 2018, the Shelby County Court was only 25% in full compliance after 6 years. And this relates to things like whether white youth and black youth are treated the same in the court. So just to kind of give a little bit of a overview as we look at this, graphic, there are generally 3 parts or 3 major parts to the juvenile court process that we need to worry about when it comes to fair treatment. That first part is cases referred to the juvenile court. So this is how youth come into contact with the Shelby County juvenile court system. So this may be through school referral. This may more likely be through law enforcement bringing kids to the juvenile court. The second area we need to think about is when, after youth are brought to the juvenile court, whether there's a decision to detain them or not. So once kids are brought there, there's at some point a decision made as to whether to let that youth return to the community and then show up at a later time for a court date, or whether they pose enough risk where they have to be detained at that time. And that's a decision that the court makes. Then the third area that we need to be concerned about is whether youth are petitioned or not. And petition means whether youth adjudicatory proceedings are pursued against them. In the criminal court, that would mean whether charges are brought or whether they receive some kind of other diversionary treatment. So that's the third area, okay? And so as the graphic suggests, and what this does is measures the relative rate index, and that tells us the likelihood that a youth receive a negative outcome at any of these 3 stages in the process. So when the Department of Justice began visiting in 2012, they found that there was huge disparities between black and white youth in all 3 of these areas. And so the way you read this, let's look at, I hope you can see, can you see the 3 words at the bottom there? If you look at referred in 2016, the blue block tells us that for every one white youth that was referred to the juvenile court, we had over 4 black youth referred to the juvenile court. That's what that tells us, okay? And then if you look at the similar figure for detained 2016, for every 1 white youth that was made, where a decision was made to detain them, there were almost 2 black youth that would have received a decision to be detained. And so on petition, same thing, okay? So that's the way we look at that. So keep in mind as we're looking at this, and I'm going to probably repeat this at some point, that as we're looking at this, legal factors such as differences in offense, so that's taken into account before these numbers are placed on the graph. So we're not looking at white youth who are doing minor truancy violations versus black youth who are doing things like gun possession, right? This graph takes that into account, and so it's comparing apples to apples, so that we're looking at white youth with assault charge and a black youth with an assault charge, and so on. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the court is nearly in compliance with all of the other areas that it mentioned when it came in 2012 and established its findings. So why can't they get it together in the area of disparate treatment of black and white youth? Why can't they get it together in the area of equal protection is the question. So there are lots of explanations why. In Shelby County Juvenile Court for a long time, and they still do, they blame the problem on who law enforcement brings into the juvenile court. The answer is, well, we can't help it if black youth are offending more often or committing more serious offenses than white youth. We can't help it if law enforcement are biased and they're bringing in more black youth. We can't help those factors, okay? So, and that's true. They can't help who comes to the court. That's true. And nor can we expect Shelby County Court to be responsible for cleaning up the culture of the Memphis Police Department as well as its own, right? So the Department of Justice began taking out the referred cases in its analysis because that takes out the law enforcement piece, right? If we're only looking at who's detained and who's petitioned, you've effectively taken out the argument that it's the police force's problem because there still is disparity in the places where only the court has a decision to make here, in detentions and in petitions. So what else is explaining that? What else? Well, Shelby County Court also likes to blame parents and say that, well, when it comes to detention, I can't let a youth just go home with anyone. It's because the parents aren't showing up or because the parents aren't following up, the parents aren't doing what they're supposed to do. Well, okay, that could be a part of the explanation. It could be a representation problem. Maybe the kids, black kids, just aren't receiving the same kind of representation, that white kids have a higher income level in Shelby County generally and therefore have access to better representation. And there may be some degree of that going on, but I think just as likely is bias could be a factor in this equation, as any other explanation likely is. And the problem is that Shelby County Court refuses to acknowledge that bias may play some part here. Okay, so I have a question. Who knows what implicit bias is, has heard of it, the science, or better yet, let me ask who does not know? Maybe I thought. Okay, so implicit bias are associations. We all have associations that we make just because of the people that we find ourselves around more often than not, the media we consume, the culture that we're in. And what happens is another way to think about it is kind of how you think about a stereotype. Associations that you may make about people of outgroups that have connections automatically in our brain. It doesn't mean you're a racist. It does not mean necessarily that you have adopted a racist ideology. It's just kind of the culture that we live in. These automatic associations tend to happen. In addition, we live very segregated. As my colleague just mentioned, we live, we work, we play in very segregated environments. And so not having a lot of cross-cultural exposure subjects all of us to some degree of implicit bias. So there's several features about juvenile court that make it highly susceptible to implicit bias. One of them being implicit biases are more often activated when we're forced to make complex decisions, on-the-spot decisions, decisions that require us to make a quick judgment. You tend to lean on automatic associations when we're in those types of situations. It's called cognitive load, when your mind has more than one thing to process or several things to process or something difficult to process. It tends to lean on our normal and kind of automatic associations about the world. So my paper offers some suggestions in both acknowledging that implicit bias exists potentially in the Shelby County courts based on what the Department of Justice repeatedly told them over the last several years, and based on some just common sense kind of data. The Shelby County Crime Commission states that about 40% of youth, they recidivate. They commit another crime after they leave Shelby County courts. So I would say that that would signify an unsuccessful Shelby County court. And I would have to think that the implicit associations that they refuse to acknowledge has a little something to do with that. Another impact is that it perpetuates a really punitive culture toward youth. If you're not aware of the implicit associations that you're making, you're more likely to rely on them, and that usually results in a more punitive attitude. There's some other things outlined in the paper, and we can talk about those more on the panel, but I give several recommendations. One of those recommendations is regular and ongoing cultural competence and implicit bias training for Shelby County Juvenile Court personnel. That includes the District Attorney's Office, the Public Defender's Office, and when I say regular and ongoing, I don't mean what we just did, what is implicit bias, here's what it is, go on about your merry way. I also recommend review of all Shelby County Juvenile Court policies and practice involving discretionary decision-making, things like charging decisions, things like whether to transfer a youth to adult court, and also the use of the DAT3 instrument that is supposed to take the bias out of decision-making when deciding whether youth pose a risk for detainment or not. I don't want to, am I over time now? I am? Okay. I got 3 more, and I'm going to try to go really quick. I'm out of breath. Improved data collection. Getting data from Shelby County courts is nearly impossible. Meaningful engagement with Black and low-income communities. If you do not know a culture, it is very hard to make good decisions on behalf of it. Increase local and state funding allocation to increase the number of judges in Shelby County juvenile courts to spread decision-making. And I think my other one, I said 3, and it's 4. And then adoption of a Tennessee racial impact law. We tend to try to solve a lot of our problems with legislation without really thinking through how those legislative measures would impact Shelby County differently from the rest of Tennessee, because it is a very different county and city than the rest of Tennessee. And so things like that, I think, would go a long way in not only helping the disparate impact problem, but also restoring a lot of the community trust that has been lost with Shelby County courts over the last several years. I look forward to your questions. Thank you so very much for being here.
Thank you. That was awesome. The next person really needs no introduction. Daphna Mcferrin, Executive Director of the Benjamin L. Hooks Institute of Social Change since 2008. And all of us know her in that capacity. But what you might not know about her is that she graduated from Harvard Law School, that her undergraduate degree is from Yale. It's a word I cannot pronounce properly. That she is, in fact, civil rights royalty. Her father was a leader in the voting registration drive that led to Tent City in Fayette County. And her family endured tremendous hardship as a result of their efforts. Ever since Daphna Mcferrin has been at the University of Memphis, she has had tremendous impact on this community, I think personally on my life. And her documentaries, her work, her leadership is something that deeply touches me. And I am very, very honored to work with her, and I would like to welcome her.
Okay, this is a paper both by me and Dr. De La Vega. And so I'm going to show you two videos. And in May 2008, these two videos took the nation by storm. The Washington Post, the New York Times, the major US papers were all reporting on these recent advances in automation. And automation is something that's very much a part of our everyday lives. But what made this different and brought it to home, I think you will see. So the first one is, no need to walk the dog. Okay, so that's the first one. So let's see if I can get out of this and then show you the second video. So the rise of the machines, and these videos were released by Boston Dynamics. They develop robots not only for everyday use, but also for the military. So we can think, as you look at these, the possible military uses of this. You can also think about how this will impact you in your everyday lives. So this one caused the most concern among people who were watching the videos. Okay, did you just see your job go away? So the way we have these papers organized, and when you pick up your policy papers going out, we first talk about the dangers of education, a fragmented education system, because first you're supposed to receive an education to prepare you for the workforce and for life. Then secondly, we have to have a system that serves you well to keep you out of the criminal justice system so that you can participate in the community, allegedly, one, to take care of your family, which is very important, and yourself, but secondly, to enter the workforce. But the question becomes, what's going to happen if, in fact, the machines replace the workforce? So these videos are not theoretical. In fact, researchers, including the Executive Office of the United States President under President Obama 2016, and Frey and Osborne, they're two of the English researchers who have published a seminal report on automation, have found that in the next 2 decades, at least 47% of the jobs in the world will be replaced by automation. So when I read this report, I'm thinking that's 2 decades, I'm going to be retired, so I don't have to worry about it. But I do have to worry about it, because if you all, as in the younger people in the audience, don't work and pay in Social Security, what happens to my Social Security? What? It'll be, yeah. So I'm in retirement with no Social Security, so then I became alarmed. All right, so So in any event, the issue of automation is not a new one. In fact, in the 1500s, Queen Elizabeth I denied a patent to Master Lee because the knitting machine he developed would have displaced workers who were using knitting machines. And she said to him, "Thou aimest high, Master Lee. Consider what the invention could do to my poor subjects. It could assuredly bring them to ruin by depriving them of employment, thus making them beggars." So Queen Elizabeth was thinking, one, I can't have massive unemployment in my British realm, because if I do, it creates social unrest, it makes people poor, it creates poverty, and then I have a bigger social issue. So she denied the patent. But that's not possible in today's world. We live in a universal, international environment. So if Company A in Memphis does not employ robots, Company B in Taiwan or China or Hong Kong will employ robots, thereby making their products more cost effective, getting more products on the market, and in fact putting out of business Company A. So the issue of automation is something that Memphis especially has to be concerned about. So it's predicted in the United States that in the next 2 decades, in the United States itself, not internationally, we will lose between 9 and 47% of our jobs due to automation. Now, Elon Musk, if you looked at the second robot who was running, and he's the owner of Tesla, the car, when he saw the robots, he said, "This is frightening." He said, "The next thing you will see is a robot moving at strobe lighting, at the speed of light, like a strobe." So can you imagine some of the uses of a robot? And I think Boston Dynamics was wise not to put a human face on the robot. I mean, they put a plastic sort of cover on it because that would have been more alarming. But robots can be used, for example, in policing. Now, you get manufacturing, warehouse distribution. In fact, some of the abuses in policing, and I say perhaps, may be mitigated by robots who might be able to disable a potential suspect, be able to do a body scan to detect a gun and determine whether or not the person has a gun. Our robots may be misused, so a robot's memory could be erased and changed. In fact, there's software now, and the Washington Post reported it, and they gave an example of Hillary Clinton speaking to Loretta Lynch in a false conversation where they conspired to end an investigation against the Clintons. Now, this conversation never took place, but there is software available now that can take your facial image and your body shape and recreate or create a conversation. So technology has, in fact, exceeded our ability to manage it. So the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies found in 2017, automation will impact all of us, but guess who it has the most impact on? Come on. It's on the board. It will have the most impact on minorities. So 31% of Latino workers and 27% of African American workers are concentrated in 30 occupations that are at the most high risk of automation. Those tend to be the less skilled occupations. So at the bottom, it goes through the kinds of occupations here. Over 1.5 times these African Americans and Latinos are more likely to be employed as cashiers, cooks, combined food preparation, serving workers, production workers, laborers, freight, material movers. They're over 3 times more likely to be security guards, bus drivers, and taxi drivers. As many of you all know from the news, we're already looking at the use of driverless vehicles. So people you see driving buses, that may be a job of the past. So we're going to take a look specifically at the impact of automation on Memphis. And why should Memphis be so concerned about automation? In fact, it's Dr. De La Vega and my contention that Memphis should lead the nation in discussing the issue of automation, because we have an African American population of approximately 65%, And unlike other cities throughout the nation, we will be most impacted by automation. So automation, we don't think is anything to be afraid of. It's something we need to get out in front of in terms of policy development. So let's talk about its impact on Memphis.
And so here are all the types of jobs and risks that Daphne has mentioned, but those are the types of jobs. Now, here is the thing. Minorities are concentrated in the 30 most vulnerable occupations. So, and you can see it goes down from Latinos, African Americans, white, and Asians. Memphis, African American employment is production, transportation, material moving, service and cleaning make 34.5% of all the occupations. And this is in comparison to the national rate for African Americans, 27.3% of whom are in this kind of occupation. So just because of the sheer number of African Americans that we have in Memphis, and then because of the much greater percent of African Americans in these very vulnerable jobs, we are doubly vulnerable. This is going to be a perfect storm. And so we're one of the largest distribution centers in the world, and we are so happy to have all of those minimum wage temp jobs, yeah. But 60,000 jobs, of which are 40,000 are occupied by African Americans. If those jobs were to be replaced by robots, we're looking at 40,000 people on the street from one day to the next. So it's pretty scary. And now with recommendations, here's Daphne.
So here are our joint recommendations. So this is a serious issue to contend with, and it is upon us. The governor and some of the state universities have taken a role in addressing this through applied technology colleges by focusing on education as they should. But the question is it enough, and is it happening fast enough? So what's clear is that Memphis has to address this first to plan a future. If 20 years will be upon us in no time. So how are we going to address this when the Memphis African-American population, and we're not just saying African-Americans, we're saying because of the large percentages, whites are clearly impacted by this. But in Memphis, disproportionately, African-Americans are impacted. So we have to get out in front of the curve. We have to be a city that has some affirmative policy measures to address retraining. We have to have affirmative policies addressing how people will receive income. So Bill Gates' proposal to this is that there should be a tax on robots. If you've seen him on PBS, his view is that so many people will be displaced that we are literally underestimating how transformative the future will be. Other experts say that it's very difficult to even train people for the future because we're not sure exactly the impact of automation on the future and what skills are needed exactly. But it's clear that income will be displaced, that the work weeks that we know will be different, that automation should complement work, not supplant work, but what does that mean exactly? None of us are totally safe from automation. Attorneys and doctors are at the higher skill level set, but many of you have gone, before you even go to a doctor, on a website to self-diagnose what your problems are, right? Others of you who have wanted to get legal assistance have gone to LegalZoom. So LegalZoom and the fact that prepackaged legal packages has made inroads on certain legal services provided to a certain segment of the community. There are even, automation has impacted discovery and how that's performed. Discovery is a process that lawyers use to prepare for a trial or to look at a case. So now automation is handling a significant portion of that. Faculty members, you're not immune from automation either. Although you're at the higher end of the food chain, the fact of the matter is the Chronicle of Education came out with an article and said that faculty members who used to be hired to crunch databases should consider having joint appointments and getting PhDs in 2 areas because computers are faster, can analyze data quickly, and faculty members are no longer needed to crunch data sets the way they did in the past. So this will impact almost every segment of society and every sector of labor. Now, to the extent it impacts it remains to be determined. We need to consider some out-of-the-box things which have been rejected by this current administration. So we have to consider universal health care because people may not be able to work due to no fault of their own. We have to consider long-term care, again, because people may not be able to work due to no fault of their own. We also have to consider retraining for jobs. Lower level jobs simply may not exist, and education which prepares people for higher level skill sets are needed. We may have to rethink vocational training. People argue that it's highly unlikely that robots will be able to perform welding or plumbing or those sorts of jobs that we typically consider blue-collar jobs. But those are the kinds of jobs that we need to think about in terms of how do we develop our workforce for the future. So I think this is an exciting area for us to explore. And lastly, and I think equally as important, experts say that those who are studying the humanities, and scientists are saying this, that we should encourage students to go to the humanities, into the humanities, because we will need people who are able to make moral judgments as to whether or not some of these approaches are ethical. And if you looked at the robot and the robot dogs, how many of you would like to go up against them? These same machines can also be used in warfare. They also can be used to police communities. So how do we protect the civil and human rights of people? We're in a brave new world that will require the best thought leaders. And I hope that this young generation will be up to the challenge. And some of us old people are going to have to deal with it too. So thank you.
And finally, for tonight, a very exciting visitor from Houston. Dr. Anna Leach has been practicing medicine at the University of Texas in Houston for a very long time. She has recently become a faculty member in palliative medicine, and she has had a private practice. One of the things that Dr. Leach, who's a graduate of the University of Houston and the University of Texas School of Medicine. So she did go to the University of Houston, which is my alma mater, to get her master's. And then she went and got her MD from University of Texas. In seeing the suffering that people encounter, and in seeing the disparities, and in seeing how these disparities have resulted in tremendous suffering at the end of life, has really had a renaissance, maybe, of thought in which she has developed an incredible compassion for patients at the end of life and for people who are suffering. And she has developed a tremendous understanding of the disparities that racial inequalities and economic inequities bring at that moment. So I would like to welcome her and hear more from what she has to say.
So they always make us do this in medical conferences because we sometimes have conflicts of interest financially. So even though nobody else seems to do that around here, I always have to do that. Just to summarize, I think from everybody's talk, we have disparities in education, so we mess you up when you're little. Then we have disparities in the justice system, so we mess you up when you're a youth. Then we have disparities in your jobs, and so we mess you up then. And we also mess you up at the end of life. So if you weren't depressed enough already, I am trying to help you out. Looking at African Americans, the disparities in just their health, looking at what percentage of African Americans versus whites, European Americans. I was trying to come up with the same number of words for each side, but more African Americans are in poor health. more African Americans are obese, although African American men and white men seem to be doing about the same. Otherwise, there's a difference in that health status impacts your life, your ability to work, your ability to live a longer life. And so we have differences in life expectancies. Just from those health disparities, from where you started off and the resources that we provide for you throughout your life. So we have a problem in this country, this American healthcare system. We all think it's amazing, but we have a for-profit system that is forced to provide free care, which is very challenging because we say, well, the private healthcare system can take care of people and we don't have to worry about it, but they just pass off the cost to somebody else, namely the rest of us. Several years ago, they created the Impala Act, that basically says that if someone shows up in an ER in an emergency or in labor, the hospital must take care of them and they cannot punt their care to somewhere else. You can't transfer a patient to a different hospital because they don't have insurance. And what has actually happened since then has been that the public healthcare system has decreased the services they provide. Because why do I really need to increase the services when the private system is going to take care of my patients and they can't not take care of them? Because there's this law that says that they have to take care of them. And the hospital must take care of the patient from the moment they arrive in the ER until they have a safe discharge. That might be 72 hours, but it might be 72 days. And the hospital has to provide that service. So we have decreased the services available in the public system since the inception of this act. We have now decided that patient satisfaction should drive decisions. And so if a patient says, I want an MRI of my whatever, we have to do it, not have to, but we end up doing it because if we don't, the patient then rates us poorly, and then we lose our jobs because we weren't rated properly. And in reality, that increases costs and decreases the outcomes that the patient should have. There's more complications from additional studies. And we spend more in this country for healthcare than other countries in the world, and we have similar outcomes or possibly even worse outcomes. And so we really need to think about the healthcare system that we have and how we're providing care. That's depressing enough statistic of the amount of money we're spending and our life expectancies. And as you can see, we are doing something terribly wrong. So after we do all of that wrong, at the end of life, we still have problems. We don't have a choice whether we get to the end of life or not. We are drugged to it, or we arrive at it peacefully, or whatever we want, but we are all going to go there. And, you know, it's challenging because nobody wants to die. So generally when I have a conversation with patients, I don't ask them if they want to die or not. The question is, how do you want to live? Because the other one is going to happen whether you want it or not. And so we don't provide preventative care. So we have more complications. We don't catch problems when they're fixable easily. We don't have resources, so even if we were to provide some preventative care and find out that somebody has diabetes, do we provide them with the medications and treatment for it? Do we provide them access to go see a physician regularly? And we also don't provide information, and we have done a really good job of creating distrust by lying to people sometimes. The Tuskegee experiments come to mind where we sort of didn't tell a group of African American men that there was treatment for syphilis, you know, because we wanted to see what happens when you don't treat it. But obviously that group of people is not going to trust us because they remember things we've done, and so we need to provide better information and develop a better relationship with people. You know, we have changed how we do things in the last few decades. So for the most of the millennia that humans have been around, we died like on the right side. We were at home, our families gave us chicken soup, a blanket, would take care of us, and when we died, our family said we did everything we could. So it was fine. We have peace of mind. Nowadays, we die like the other side, and that's doing everything. A machine to replace your kidneys, a machine to replace your lungs, a machine to replace your heart, and we have to decide, do we really want everything possible? Or do we really want to have all these things done to us? So advanced directives are very important. making sure that we have expressed what we want and how we want it. It's very uncomfortable, but my thought on that, having these discussions, is I equate it with talking with your teenagers about sex. It's very uncomfortable. Nobody wants to do it. But if you don't talk with your teenagers about sex, bad things happen. Much worse things than a conversation over 30 minutes. And so having the advanced directives prevents from having really bad things happening to you. We are unable to understand because of the issues we've addressed on literacy and education and trust. We need to be able to have these conversations and speak clearly and be able to explain what that right and the left pictures mean, and do people really want that? And we're giving people choices between bad and bad. We say, well, do you want to die in pain or do you want to die faster? Well, how about, can I live longer not in pain? But unfortunately, sometimes that's not a choice. So having advanced directives is very important. Tennessee is actually lucky because you have post forms, which we don't in Texas. But filling out post forms and advanced directives is a way to at least communicate your wishes. The Hospice Benefit, which is used for people at the end of life who have decided to concentrate on comfort, was started in the 1980s, but it assumed at that point that there was a caregiver. Back when a lot of families were single income families, there was somebody at home who could take care of you. And so that was the assumption when they developed this program. And the assumption is most patients are home, their families are taking care of them, and they provide some services. Nurses come by occasionally, but they're not there all the time. So what I suggest for policy suggestions at the end of life is to have better education, both in the early times when we talk about these decisions. And obviously you're not going to talk to a third grader about death and dying, but you can talk to them about taking care of themselves and understanding health implications. There's a lot of issues with health literacy where patients do not take their medications properly because they don't understand the way it was prescribed. So if you say take it twice a day, well, does that mean I take it at 9 a.m. and 10 a.m., or does it mean I take it breakfast and lunch, or what does that mean? And we usually assume it means take it twice a day, like 12 hours apart, but we don't explain those things. And so having education in the earlier years to have better health literacy is important, but also at the higher education have communication skills and empathy. Because if I can't communicate with someone who doesn't have those literacy skills, I have not done my job properly. And so making sure that I have those skills is important. Make sure that there's healthcare access, whether it's to encourage prevention, improve access, provide better services. And I know that goes back to the sort of equal access to healthcare that we're struggling with as a country. And so I'm not necessarily saying that Shelby County can fix that, but it's certainly something to think about. Having encouraged the advanced directives, as I talked, making sure that we understand what the person values, having open communication. There is nothing worse than having a 95-year-old woman in the hospital with a massive stroke, and the family says, well, we never thought about what she wanted when she was this sick. Did you think grandma was going to live forever? Because she's like 95. So maybe you should have talked about whether she wanted to be on a breathing machine or not. But we don't talk about those things, so make sure we have open communication. And most importantly, I think, to try to mitigate some of the differences in end of life, making sure that all funding sources have hospice services. When the ACA was developed, the end of life care was not part of those 10 important tenets of healthcare. And so some of those policies do not cover hospice care. So you have someone who thought they did what they could, they have insurance they bought on the marketplace, and they have a catastrophic diagnosis, and then we find out that we don't have a way to provide care for them other than charity work, which is okay, but that again goes back and taxes that private system that we like so much. And to have residential care. So as it stands right now, someone who is very sick, who's potentially dying in the next week or 2 weeks, has no place to go. We tell family, we'll just be able to take care of him, because in the 1980s when we developed this program, you had a stay-at-home spouse who could take care of you. And so where is your stay-at-home spouse now? Oh yeah, we're working for $7 an hour and my stay-at-home spouse can't take care of me anymore. And so we need to be able to provide for that. The nursing homes generally will take Medicaid, but they don't take Medicaid pending. What that means is when someone who was not living at the nursing home already moves into a nursing home, it takes Medicaid some time to process that application. And if that application is not completed and processed before the patient dies, Medicaid just says, well, the patient's dead, why should we continue processing the application? They drop the application and they don't pay the nursing home. As a result, when someone has a very limited life expectancy, the nursing home says, well, we just can't take you because we know we're not sure we're going to get paid, so we're not going to do this. So families are forced to choose between staying in the hospital, possibly providing treatments that are not beneficial, that are painful and uncomfortable, instead of choosing to have their loved one in a more comfortable setting because they can't afford to take time off from work. They can't afford to take a few days there, even if they're eligible for having FMLA doesn't pay you. And if we're living on minimum wage, you can't afford to be off on FMLA for 2 weeks while you're taking care of grandma. It's just not a choice. And so providing residential care or some sort of care for those patients who just don't have a caregiver, but allowing them to make a choice that's right for them would be very important. Thank you.